Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for getting up bright and early and coming over here from your breakfast and joining us to talk about Saudi Arabia this morning. I'm one of the panelists. I'll be substituting for our discussant who couldn't make it to the conference. So it's my distinct privilege to introduce our first speaker, who'll be opening this panel on Saudi Arabia then and now. Bunzel will be speaking on moderation in Islam, or toward moderation in Islam, reassessing the Sahwa and Wahhabism in MBS's Saudi Arabia. Cole is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. His work focuses on the history of Saudi Arabia and militant Islamism. He's the author of Wahhabism, the history of a militant Islamic movement, which I use in one of the courses I teach. So, Cole, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks. Good morning. Now we have a lot of choices, so we thank you for choosing Saudi Arabia. My paper is about the ongoing transformation in Saudi Arabia, particularly over the past 8 or 9 years since the rise to power of Mohammed bin Salman, the ambitious young crown prince, and in particular the ways that he has sought to recalibrate the country's identity and in particular its approach to Islam, particularly away from Islamism and Wahhabism in the direction of what he has tended to call moderation, i'tidal, in Islam. So I'll be talking mainly about how Saudi Arabia under MBS has drastically changed its approach both to the Islamist Sahwa movement of the 1980s and 1990s, and even more dramatically to the Wahhabi movement that has long served as the ideological basis of the rule of the El Saud. So just so we're all on the same page, and as I'm sure you're all well aware, Mohammed bin Salman, who's pictured here on the right, or MBS as he is popularly known, and as I'll refer to him, he's the favorite son of King Salman here, who came to power in 2015, January 2015. King Salman is a spring chicken. He's 88 years old. MBS is 39. He's my age, to put things in perspective. And what that means is that when MBS becomes king, and he will become king, that will represent the first generational change in the history of the modern kingdom of Saudi Arabia since, I think it was 1953, when King Abdulaziz died. So the modern Saudi state was founded in 1932 by this man, King Abdulaziz, and since then, as this chart shows, all the rulers of the kingdom have been the sons of Abdulaziz, but Salman is slated to be the last of them. And he's already devolved basically all power, all the day-to-day rule to his son MBS. MBS becomes crown prince in 2017, and famously he set out to consolidate power and cut down any and all rivals, as demonstrated most infamously in the Ritz-Carlton affair of October 2017. Apart from the consolidation of power, he has also made a name for himself by launching these sets of ambitious reforms under the rubric of an initiative known as Vision 2030, which I'm sure you're also all aware of. It was first issued in the form of an 85-page document, 85 pages at least in English, back in April 2016 when he was not yet crown prince, but though it had a foreword by MBS. The document makes extensive reference to economic reforms aimed at decreasing the country's reliance on oil and on social reforms to make life more enjoyable for young Saudis, including by promoting new forms of entertainment. But it also made extensive reference to the idea of, quote, moderation, i'tidal, that was the previous slide, i'tidal in Islam. So you can see here our vision. This comes from the foreword written by MBS, or signed by MBS. Our vision is a strong, thriving, and stable Saudi Arabia that provides opportunity for all. Our vision is a tolerant country with Islam as its constitution and moderation as its method. Now, what MBS meant by this focus on moderation still remained to be seen, but it wasn't long before he began removing the religious police from the streets, allowed women to drive, permitted movie theaters to open for the first time in decades, and ended the requirement that restaurants and stores close during prayer time, which was, if you've ever lived in the kingdom, highly disruptive, especially if you're just trying to work at a coffee shop. So clearly the version of Islam he sought to promote was not that kind of Islam. It was not the enforced public morality in accordance with the strict interpretation of Sharia. But what was it really? So the first extensive remarks that MBS delivered on the subject of moderation came here in a business meeting in Riyadh known as the Future Investment Initiative back in October 2017. We just saw another meeting of the initiative. I think it was last week or the 2 weeks before. And here you can see Fox journalist Maria Bartiromo asking MBS about the kingdom's previous promotion of what she called radical ideas, to which MBS responded not by saying that, no, Saudi Arabia has never done nothing wrong, Wahhabism is great, as you would see some previous kings and princes say, but he said these words: Saudi Arabia was not like that. Before 1979, the project of the Sahwa spread in Saudi Arabia and in the entire region after 1979 for many reasons that need not be gotten into today. We were not like that in the past. We are merely going back to what we had before, which is moderate, balanced, and here it's wasati, mu'tadil Islam that is open to the world, to all religions, and to all traditions and peoples. We represent tolerant, moderate, true values. So 2 words here are of course key. The first is 1979, which is what coincided with the uprising in the Grand Mosque in Mecca by Juhayman al-Utaybi, and of course also the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And the second word is this Sahwa, a term that denotes, or that means awakening in Arabic and stands for Islamic awakening, and that refers to this upsurge in Islamist activity in the kingdom in the 1980s and 1990s. So for MBS, the Sahwa was the scourge that had wreaked societal havoc and set the country back decades. In 1979 was the catalyst of the Sahwa. And so his approach here was to say, we represent true Islam, moderate Islam. The Sahwa was what was the aberration in our country's history. Before that, we were just normal. Not exactly historically accurate, but at least we see an acknowledgement that something was amiss. So the roots of the Sahwa ran much deeper than of just 1979, as Stéphane Lacroix and others have shown. The Sahwa was a broad-based socio-political movement that goes back to the 1960s, and that mixed the Islamist traditions of the Muslim Brotherhood with the puritanical theological traditions of Wahhabism and Salafism, which I'll come to shortly. But indeed, it is true that the Sahwa's influence gained greater influence over society in the 2 decades after 1979, and that it was promoted by the Saudi authorities. It was only in the mid-1990s when the Sahwa morphed into an opposition movement that the kingdom actually cracked down on it, arresting some of the major figures, such as Salman al-Auda and Safar al-Khawali. But some of these figures would then become rehabilitated. Al-Auda would have his own television show for years, sort of a celebrity sheikh for at least a decade, although that's not what is happening now. In fact, MBS had arrested a number of the Sahwa scholars, including Al-Auda, just days before these remarks, and Al-Auda remains in prison today. And the pretext for his arrest was a tweet that he had sent about promoting good relations between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but we can get into the reasons why later if anyone is more interested. Of course, the great Wahhabi elephant in the room was not being mentioned here. Wahhabism being the founding ideology of the Saudi state and a notoriously intolerant version of Islam, but MBS would, in fact, soon get to that. So just a few words on Wahhabism to back up very briefly. Wahhabism was integral to the ancestral Saudi state that took form in the mid-18th century. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, as the story goes, the namesake of Wahhabism, had begun preaching a doctrine of Tawheed, of exclusivist monotheism in Najd in Central Arabia in 1741, calling on the faithful to renounce what he saw as widespread practices of shirk, of polytheism, and to return to the worship of the true God as one. And in 1744, Ibn Abdul Wahhab seeks refuge in the town of Dar'iyah, which had been under the rule of a man named Muhammad bin Saud since either 1726 or 1727. And the two agreed to support one another, and the embryonic state of Dar'iyah grows into the first Saudi state, or what would later be called, or would become known as the first Saudi state, conquering the different towns and districts of Najd in the name of expanding the true ambit of Islam and ultimately extending across most of the Arabian Peninsula, like this, the only trick I have. In the early 1800s, it conquers Mecca and Medina, which prompts the Ottomans to intervene, dispatching the Egyptians to destroy the Saudi state, which they do in 1818. But in 1823, there's a second Saudi state that's formed that lasts till 1887. And then finally, in 1902, the Emir Abdulaziz El Saud conquers Riyadh, starting the process again, inaugurating the third Saudi state, which would go on to be called the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. And the ideological basis for all of these states was the Saudi Wahhabi Pact, reached in 1744 or thereabouts between Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud. And this is something that you see in pretty much all of the statements of the various kings of Saudi Arabia, going back to the founder, Abdulaziz. So this, just to take a couple of examples, because one of the things that I'll be showing is that this fidelity to the Wahhabi tradition, to this pact of Ad-Dariyah in 1744, is no longer being professed. And they're actually creating a new historical narrative that doesn't include it at all. So it's important to establish just how central this notion of the pact was to the ideology, to the legitimacy of Saudi Arabia in the 20th century. So here's King Abdulaziz in a letter he wrote to a northern district in 1917. God Almighty blessed us and you with the da'wah, the mission of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and his elucidation of the religion of Islam. Indeed, we are the supporters of those who call to what Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab called to, and we adhere to what our ancestors who supported him adhered to. Whosoever opposes that, whether through laxity or extremism, let him blame only himself, and may he know that we will deal with him and we will apply to him that which the book and the Sunnah require. So not only are we Wahhabis, a term of course they don't use, but which I think as an analytical term is perfectly legitimate. So not only are we Wahhabis, but those who are not Wahhabis, who don't adhere to what we adhere to, we might have to deal with them accordingly, sort of a threat. Here is King Fahd in a speech that he gave in 1992 upon the promulgation of something known as the Saudi Basic Law of Governance. In modern history, more than 2.5 centuries ago, the first Saudi state was founded on the basis of Islam when two righteous men and reformers, the Imam Muhammad ibn Saud and the Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, may God have mercy on them, formed a pact to this end. The first Saudi state was founded on a clear path encompassing politics, governance, predication, and society. So a very clear statement that the first Saudi state was founded with the pact in 1744, although he didn't use the year, but his point stands. Perhaps no Saudi ruler in modern history said more about the pact of Ad-Dariyah than the man who is currently the king and MBS's father, King Salman. This is a speech that he gave upon the opening of a new building for the religious police in 1999. He said, the legitimacy of this state, as I always say, derives from its belief in the agreement between the two imams, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, Muhammad bin Saud, and its undertaking to support this da'wah in 1157, i.e. 1744. So one of the first signs that MBS was turning away from this view came in an interview on Saudi television in April 2021, in which MBS denied that Saudi Arabia has any special attachment to the teachings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. And he said that the state adheres to no particular school, no particular madrasa. And so these were the beginnings of some sort of rumblings of, well, maybe we're not Wahhabis. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is not perfect. We don't adhere to his every word. I think he also said in these remarks, and as Brandon also wrote in his paper, we need to practice ijtihad, and if Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab were to come out of his grave and saw us adhering to his every last word, then he would be the first to oppose this. So what happens is he issues a royal decree in the name of his father in January 2022, in which he basically says, in which he announces a new holiday to be known as Founding Day, Yom Ta'sis. And Founding Day, as this statement says, notes that this blessed state began 3 centuries ago with the reign of Imam ibn Saud when he founded the first Saudi state in early 1727. So for the first time, we see a statement by the Saudi authorities that the first Saudi state was founded not in 1744, but in 1727, and that it was founded by Muhammad bin Saud alone and not by him and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab together. And the theme of the rule of Muhammad bin Saud was not intolerant, exclusivist, militant Wahhabism, but it was rather the idea that the state provided unity and security in the Arabian Peninsula following centuries of fragmentation, dissension, and instability. And February 22nd of every Gregorian calendar year would become the new founding day holiday. And if you're wondering why they adopted February 22nd, the answer is that they actually don't know when Muhammad bin Saud came to power in the Diriyah. The sources simply say the year 1139 Hijri, which could be 1726 or 1727. But if you go to a Hijri Gregorian calendar converter on the internet and you type in the midpoint of 1139, it spits out February 22nd. And that's how they decided that that's when the state was founded, which is not the most solid, perhaps, historical basis. Now, the Saudis did not acknowledge that they were revising the history of the kingdom, but it would be left to university professors, journalists, so forth, to do that for them. This is just one example from the official Saudi press called the Inside Story of Saudi Arabia's Founding Day, celebrating the year it all began. I don't have time to read it all, but it's kind of Orwellian in saying, for generations, historians and writers have unwittingly perpetuated the myth that the first Saudi state, forerunner of the modern-day kingdom of Saudi Arabia, was founded in the year 1744. But in fact, as a new reappraisal of the origins of the kingdom reveals, they were 17 years out. So there's a new ideology in town. It was in 1727 that Imam Muhammad bin Saud came to the throne carrying with him the dream of transforming the city-state founded by his forebears 3 centuries earlier into the capital of a nation, which at its height would bring peace and stability to most of the Arabian Peninsula. So again, here you see this emphasis on peace and stability and those sorts of themes. A lot of this is reflected on the official Founding Day website, which you can go to, foundingday.sa. Here you'll see in the description of Founding Day, more emphasis on peace, stability, and justice, similar themes. Also here, Diriyah, the capital of the Saudi state, became a flourishing center for commerce, culture, and knowledge, not conquest by means of militant Wahhabi Islam. More emphasis on unity, stability within Diriyah. I'm skipping ahead because I don't have too much time. Here again, this comes from one of the Founding Day books. Along with the website, there's an array of literature, including books produced by different ministries in Saudi Arabia that are trying to elaborate this new history. It says that Muhammad bin Saud began planning to change the prevailing status quo, laying down a new path in the region's history toward unity, education, the spread of culture, enhanced communication between members of society, and enduring security. Another thing I should note is that MBS at least does acknowledge, do I have 2 minutes? Yeah. At least he does acknowledge that there is some problem with the historical narrative, that it does not depend, that it is a departure from the existing literature that was produced in the country in the 18th and 19th centuries. So this is from an interview that MBS gave to The Atlantic in early 2022. He said to him, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, he's not a prophet, he's not an angel, he's one scholar in the first Saudi Arabia among many scholars. The only problem at that time in the Arabian Peninsula was that the only people who know how to read and write are the students of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. So the history is being written based on how they view it. So basically what he's saying is that the early chronicles, which highlight the preeminent role of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and really demote Muhammad bin Saud to his secondary character, they were just biased because they were Wahhabis themselves. And so we have to reimagine history in a way that is more advantageous to me politically. And that seems to be the idea of Founding Day. You see a lot of hyper-nationalist Saudis will put 1727 in their Twitter handles. That's kind of a way of signaling, I'm with the new Saudi Arabia. The problem is that there really is so little to go on here. The historical basis for this new history, I've spent a lot of time in the chronicles and literature of the 18th and 19th centuries of Saudi Arabia, and there's really hardly anything that you could possibly draw on to paint an actual picture of, say, Muhammad ibn Saud, as is done here. So it's kind of a new cartoonish version of history, but I think that one might be able to, in a more positive vein, say that to the extent that it is a historical lie, perhaps it is a good lie in the way that it wants to achieve something that is the intended moderation of Islam in the kingdom and the transformation more generally in terms of social and economic reform. So with that, I'll end. Thanks.
Thanks, Cole. Right on time. So let me introduce myself. I didn't do that at the outset. My name is Brandon Friedman. I'm a senior research fellow and director of research at the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. My remarks today are based on an article I recently completed titled Saudi Arabia, Becoming a Nation, ? My core argument is that MBS, who we heard about from Cole, and his Vision 2020, or Vision 2030, represents Saudi Arabia's first effort at nation building. And what I mean is that Saudi Arabia, or the Saudi nation, rather than the Islamic Ummah, is the primary source of legitimacy, loyalty, and identity, or at least that's the ambition of the Saudi ruling elites today. MBS is seeking to redefine the role of Saudi rulers, not only as custodians of Islam, but also as the embodiment of the Saudi nation. MBS is seeking to reinvent the horizontal bond between Saudis, substituting the shared experience of reinventing the Saudi state for as Wahhabi Islam, as Cole outlined earlier. In April 2021, MBS gave an interview on Al Arabiya, and it was nothing short of extraordinary. He seemed to be trying to separate Islam in the kingdom from its 300 plus years of Wahhabi orientation. This is no easy feat, as Cole also described to us. My argument makes two claims that challenge some of the existing literature on Saudi Arabia. First, I do not, in distinction from Madawi al-Rashid, believe that the modern Saudi state has promoted nationalism prior to MBS. I do not see Vision 2030 as bread and circuses, as al-Rashid argues in her book, The Sun King. Second, contra Stéphane Lacroix, who Cole also referred to, I don't see MBS as trying to destroy the horizontal solidarity among Saudis, which he argues is solely based on Islam. I don't see it as an autocratic power grab, though there's much to say about how MBS rules. I think MBS is seeking to remake the horizontal bonds of solidarity that exist in Saudi Arabia, not to destroy them. But I also don't see Saudi national consciousness or nationness, as American sociologist Rogers Brubaker refers to it, as solely a top-down process being artificially engineered by MBS, which is a lot of what you hear in the popular media. I see Saudi national identity as genuine and being driven by events that the kingdom has experienced, particularly since 2011. Saudi national identity has crystallized, in part due to a sense of Saudi otherness created by perceived threats from hostile enemies, which have grown intense since the 2010-2011 Arab uprisings. I'll briefly describe what those hostile enemies look like to Saudis. First of all, and perhaps most importantly, Iran's regional expansion, which the Saudis see as encirclement. Iran has managed to make great inroads in Iraq prior to 2010-11, and since then cemented its influence in Iraq, expanded its influence and control in Syria, made inroads into Bahrain, Lebanon, and Yemen. The Saudis have also looked around their neighborhood since 2010, 2011, and seen chaos and civil war engulf the region as a result of political upheaval in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria. the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and its influence on the Sahwis, who Cole mentioned, in Saudi Arabia, in tearing those countries apart, is also something the Saudis have taken note of, particularly the modernists. And of course, the rise of the Islamic State in 2014, and at the same time, the rise of the Houthis in Yemen, created a sense of siege in the kingdom. In each case, the threat that the Saudis perceived at their borders was being driven by an Islamic movement, a radical Islamic movement in the eyes of the Saudi rulers. MBS's effort to transform Saudi Arabia into a flag bearer of moderate Islam, as grossly misrepresentative of Saudi history, as Cole argues, as it may be, it's rooted in this threat perception that the Saudis see at their borders over the last 15 years. So what is this new Saudi nationalism that I've referred to several times? Abdallah Hamid ad-Din, the director of research of the King Faisal Center in the Kingdom, writing more than a decade ago, characterized nationhood in the kingdom as a practice, and it aspired to be collective action, a collective experience that Saudis shared. He pointed out that religious leaders in Saudi Arabia have actively resisted the creation of a Saudi nation. And if we look at National Day in contrast to Founding Day, each September 23rd, it's almost, Hamid ad-Din reminds us, for the youth in Saudi Arabia, a go wild day, a day in which Wahhabi norms don't apply. And it's something that has been increasingly embraced by Saudi young people. So now, Saudi nationalism, in essence, is being produced by three processes: socioeconomic, cultural, and political. And these are reinforcing and interlocking processes. First, the socioeconomic, which is the one that most people talk about, and that's embodied by MBS's Vision 2030 plan. And really, it's important to understand that first and foremost, what that plan is trying to do is to mobilize Saudis, in particular youth and women. And two-thirds of the population in Saudi Arabia today are generally under 30 years old. And this is part of the ambition to move Saudi Arabia from an economy completely dependent on oil revenues, what's known as rentierism, to a market-driven economy. Okay, I'll have more to say on that if you want in the Q&A, or perhaps in a few minutes if I've got time, but I want to focus on some of the other issues as well. Cultural, and here this is incredible from my perspective, looking at Saudi history, is what the kingdom is actively encouraging it. You see it in the 88-page introductory document to Vision 2030, which Cole referred to, is actively encouraging Saudi young people to embrace their individualism. Saudi Arabia was always a very collective society, and Islam, and in particular Wahhabi Islam, encourages that, and Saudi tribal norms reinforce it. And here we have, for the first time, a document that encourages Saudis as a whole, but in particular, I think it's directed to young people, to embrace and self-actualize as individuals. And that's my reading of the document. Those aren't words that specifically appear in the document. Through this shared experience of state building, meaning he's calling on Saudis to actively participate in this building of a new Saudi state. And he's encouraging Saudis to take individual responsibility as an expression of their shared obligation to this Saudi nation. This is an incredible transformation culturally in terms of mindset, mentality, and social and cultural norms. For a generation at least, since Faisal was running the country in the early 1960s, I would argue up until MBS, Saudis were asked not to participate in the active life of the country. The exact opposite. Rentierism was sort of a buying out of the Saudi population in exchange for their consent to Saudi political control. And now that seems to be, that whole arrangement is in the process of being upended as I see it. In terms of the political component of Saudi nationalism, I would say it has two important aspects. The first is, it is trying to convey that the exclusive authority of the territorial bureaucratic state reigns supreme in Saudi Arabia, meaning it is not Islam or Wahhabism that shares authority in the kingdom, as was the union between the ulama and the umara for generations. But now it is the territorial and bureaucratic state that sits atop the hierarchy of power in the kingdom. There's no more power sharing. It is very clear MBS is trying to subordinate the religious authorities to the Saudi rulers. And that in and of itself is a major transformation. Secondly, it is clear the state is making every effort to foster these linked ideas of peoplehood, nationhood, and citizenship as the fundamental source of Saudi unity. No longer will Islam be the fundamental source of national unity. It will be the Saudi identity based on peoplehood, nationhood, and citizenship. That doesn't mean Islam doesn't matter, and it doesn't mean that Saudi Arabia is becoming secular. Islam will remain the idiom of daily life in the kingdom. It will dominate the cultural sphere as it has. But it won't be the major source of political legitimacy, and as the state aspires it to be, unity between Saudis themselves. Vision 2030 encompasses all three of these processes: socioeconomic, cultural, and political. And that's why I think it's misunderstood when many scholars and others refer to Vision 2030 as a program of economic reform or social and religious reform. It is not just those things. That's a far too narrow way of looking at what Vision 2030 is about. Vision 2030 is a political program for nationalism, first and foremost, in my reading of it. Okay? And we see this. Cole referred to Yom Ta'sis, the new founding day, and how it came to be. Others have written about the fact that, the symbol of Founding Day represents new national symbols that encompass Saudi history, culture, economy, and life, but not religion. The Shahada doesn't appear on the flag of Founding Day, which is quite extraordinary when you think about Saudi identity up until MBS. In conclusion, I want to say something about the periodization of Saudi history. Saudi Arabia today is in its third phase of state building, as I see it. State building, okay? The first phase, as Joseph Kostner argued in his book, it was a transformation from tribal chieftaincy under Ibn Saud to the monarchical state, okay? And this was enabled by the discovery of oil and oil revenues. The second phase of Saudi state building is what I would call Faisal's order, or what Kostner and Teitelbaum have referred to as Faisal's order, really the rentierism, okay? And this was the notion of exchanging political consent for a generous social welfare package, meaning the demobilization of Saudi society, okay? That's the second phase of state building, and I think it lasted up until King Salman and MBS. And now we're experiencing or seeing the third phase of Saudi state building, which is Muhammad's order, as I would call it, which is Saudi nationalism. And that, I think, is the first phase of Saudi nation building. In the first two phases, Wahhabi Islam was the state source of political legitimacy. Wahhabism was a state religion. But over the past 50 years, the Wahhabi religious establishment has lost control over Islam in the kingdom. It's lost its monopoly over the Islam in the kingdom. And Cole tells this story better than I do, but the truth of the matter is, the state, in some cases, consciously sought to weaken the Wahhabi religious establishment's control over Islam, and at the same time also unintentionally weakened it even further. And this is the story of the Sahwis, which Lacroix and others have told. Therefore, Saudi Arabia is turning to nationalism as an alternative to Wahhabism, as an alternative form of political legitimacy for the monarchy. I'll conclude with something Clifford Geertz wrote in his book, Old Societies and New States, many, many years ago in the 1960s. And he referred to the integrative revolution, which makes the point that's easy to overstate the power of the modern state. And MBS is trying to transform the kingdom. In periods of transformation, the state becomes a site of fierce political contestation. It is far from clear whether MBS will succeed in building a Saudi nation and reshape Islam in the kingdom. Meaning, it's all very fragile what's happening right now. But I think it's wrong to see it as an artificial engineering of the Saudi people. That steals agency from many, many Saudi young people and women who are doing amazing and unthinkable things in the kingdom that no one could have possibly imagined just 10 years ago. Saudis seem to be embracing this new vision of a Saudi nation. And I don't think we should minimize that. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, Elad Giladi, the title of his remarks is Saudi Arabia's Homegrown Slavery and the Saudi Novel. Elad is a lecturer in the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of Haifa. He's a historian specializing in the social and cultural history of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. His primary focus is social and cultural change in Saudi Arabia through the prism of the Saudi novel, with a particular emphasis on issues of identity and gender. Elad, baksha.
Thank you, Brandon, for this introduction, and thank you, everybody, for turning out at this early morning today. So, I'll be talking today about Saudi Arabia's homegrown slavery. It's a term that I coined. I'll try to explain what exactly it means, and about slavery in the Saudi novel. So, okay. So even though quite a lot has been written about slavery and the slave trade in the Arabian Peninsula from the time of the Ottoman Empire until the abolition of slavery in the Saudi Kingdom and its aftermath, the subject of slavery and racial discrimination in modern Saudi fiction has remained an understudied body of Arabic literature. This is because Saudi fiction in the 20th century had either dodged the subject or treated it rather casually. Only in the 21st century, with the leap, the tafra, in the Saudi fiction, appeared several writers who strived to correct sociocultural stereotypes and misconceptions regarding minorities, including black-skinned individuals, by rereading history. In light of that, the novel Mudun Ta'kul al-Ushb is important and unique, both chronologically, it was written in 1998, and thematically. Through this novel, Abdul Khal, one of Saudi Arabia's most prominent authors, sheds light on the unspoken phenomenon of what I call homegrown slavery in Saudi Arabia. That is, kidnapping of young Saudi children from remote parts of the kingdom to sell them in slave markets of big cities such as Jeddah, Mecca, and Riyadh. One of the novel's characters, Hamid, is such a child, and I'll talk about him later on. Through critical reading and analysis of this novel, my paper will show that the story of Hamid, the slave, serves mainly to highlight the story of the protagonist, Yahya, an immigrant from a southern village who unknowingly or knowingly becomes sort of a slave in Jeddah. I argue that these stories of slavery serve in turn as an allegory of the tangled rural-urban relations in Saudi Arabia and of the exploitation of the village and its people by the city and its dwellers. In the Gulf area and the Arabian Peninsula, slavery was not abolished until well into the 20th century, despite diplomatic pressure from Britain and treaties signed between the British government and Arab leaders aimed at prohibiting human trafficking in the Indian Ocean. In Saudi Arabia, slavery was not abolished until 1962. during the rule of King Faisal, although the importation of slave was curbed beforehand. Saudi fiction in the 20th century had either dodged the subject of slavery and its legacies of racial discrimination, marginalization, and oppression, or treated it rather casually. In addition, a Saudi researcher, Sana Daher, rightfully claimed the subject of slavery and racial discrimination in modern Saudi fiction, whether by men or women, has remained an understudied body of Arabic literature. The examples of 20th century Saudi novels that tackle the issue of slavery are very scarce. The 21st century has witnessed a leap, a tafra, in Saudi fiction, and produced several writers who strive to correct socio-cultural stereotypes and misconceptions regarding minorities, including black-skinned individuals. Most of these writers grew up in the second half of the 20th century and have witnessed first or second hand how slaves, ex-slaves, and other black individuals have been perceived by Saudi society. One such writer, for example, is Mahmoud Traouri, a descendant of African immigrants from Mali, whose novel Maymuna, you can see here, spans the life of 3 generations of free Muslim immigrants to the Arabian Peninsula. The novel dwells on the vulnerability of black immigrants during the early decades of the 20th century. The fact that they were Muslim and free did not rule out their being kidnapped and enslaved illegally. Another example is Yusuf al-Muhaymid Fikhakh al-Raikha, which was translated into Wolves of the Crescent Moon, presents a black man kidnapped as a boy from Sudan, castrated, and sold to a family in Arabia. The 1998 novel Mudun Takul al-Ushb, henceforth Mudun, stands out both chronologically and thematically. Abdul Khal, one of Saudi Arabia's most prominent authors, sheds light on the unspoken phenomenon of homegrown slavery in Saudi Arabia. That is, the kidnapping, usually by Bedouins, of young Saudi children from remote rural parts of Saudi Arabia to be sold as slaves in big cities. However, the slavery theme does not stand on its own in this novel. Rather, it serves a certain purpose, as we shall discuss below. Abdul Khal was born in the village of Al-Majanna in southern Saudi Arabia in 1962. In early childhood, his family moved to Jeddah, where he still lives. He studied political science at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, and in 1982 started working in journalism. He is managing editor of the newspaper Okaz, and is one of the leaders of the literary club of Jeddah. Khal has written so far more than half a dozen short story collections and a dozen of novels, and a dozen novels, some of which have been translated into several European languages. His novel Tarmi Bishara won the International Prize for Arabic Fiction, known as the Arabic Booker, in 2010. Khal's works, sometimes highly critical of Saudi society, have often been banned in Saudi Arabia. The plot of Mudun is set between the mid-1950s and the mid-1960s and tells the story of Yahya, who resides with his mother and 4 younger siblings in a small poverty-stricken village in southern Saudi Arabia. After his father passed away, and because of his family's dire economic situation, Yahya was sent to Jeddah to work and provide for his family. He leaves with the Hajj convoy, accompanied by his elderly grandmother, but the convoy suffers difficulties along the way and gets lost, and Yahya's grandmother passes away. Fortunately for Yahya, or not, a man who tags along to the convoy decides to take care of him. But soon, Yahya realizes that the intentions of that man, whose name is ironically Tahir, i.e. pure, in Arabic, are not entirely altruistic and pure. The convoy disperses when it reaches Jizan, and Yahya continues with Tahir to Jeddah, moving from village to village, where Yahya works as a waiter or a busboy. Taher allegedly takes care of him and saves his money for him. But when they finally reach Jeddah, Taher gives all the money that he saved for Yahya to his wife. Yahya works in Jeddah to send money to his family, and Taher promises to send his money to his mother with a trustworthy person. Later, it turns out that Taher never sent Yahya's money to his family, but kept it for himself. In time, it becomes clear that Taher used Yahya just as he was used before when he arrived as a young man from a southern village to the big city. And thus, the circle of exploitation and loss repeats itself generation after another. The novel's main theme is rural-urban relations and the tangled relationship between the city and the village. In this novel, in Mudun, as the villages are dying or already dead, the villagers who immigrate to the city hoping for a better life end up being exploited. Khal portrays an endless circular motion of exploitation, manipulation, sorrow, and despair when every generation of newcomers from the village falls victim to the exploitation and then proceeds to exploit the next generation and so on. The city is perceived as a filthy and hostile place that chews the villagers up and spits them out or devours them altogether. Returning to the village is never a viable option, since nothing awaits the ex-villagers there, according to Khal, besides poverty, hunger, disease, and death. Another theme of the novel is the unspoken phenomenon of homegrown slavery in Saudi Arabia. Matthew Hopper mentions the kidnapping of members of the free African population in Arabia in parallel with the decline of the importation of slaves from East Africa, but does not mention the kidnapping of non-African children. It is only reasonable to assume that the rise in demand for local slaves promoted the kidnapping of non-African children from rural areas as part of the phenomenon that I called homegrown slavery. To the best of my knowledge, Khal's is the only Saudi novel to even mention this issue. Hamid, one of the leading characters of this novel, is such a child, and the plot follows him from his kidnapping until after the abolition of slavery. So I, with the help of AI, in order to make it easier for you to follow, I constructed this diagram, so try to keep up. There are a lot of names and a lot of going on, so you can use this diagram, hopefully. So Yahya meets Hamid at the beginning of the novel when Yahya and Taher make their way to Jeddah, and Yahya works as a waiter in a coffee shop in one of the villages along the way. One day, a man came into the coffee shop, leaving 3 little children outside in shackles and clothes covered with blood. Yahya confronted the man and asked him whether these were his children and why he treated them like that, until another waiter pulled him away and advised him not to mess with this person who was actually a slave trader, unless he wanted to join the shackled children who were about to be sold as slaves. Afterwards, Yahya decided to free the children, but when he tried to pick the lock, his knife slipped and cut the hand of one of the children, Hamid, whose screams woke up the furious slave trader. The man grabbed Yahya by the throat and was about to chain him with the other children, but Yahya's colleagues intervened at the last moment and saved him. Yahya and Taher continued their way to Jeddah, moving from village to village, where Yahya worked and Taher did nothing but save his money for him. When Yahya confronted him about it, he replied that Yahya needed him because if he were alone, he would probably get kidnapped and sold into slavery. The harsh image of the shackled children had been burned into his mind and served as a constant reminder. At that point, the reader already senses that Taher is taking advantage of Yahya, But Tahir still enjoys the benefit of the doubt, since he is also taking care of Yahya and protecting him from a fate like Hamid's. However, this is where Khal starts to construct the irony and the comparison between Yahya and Hamid. 5 years later, Yahya was about 18 years old and worked as a waiter in a coffee shop in Jeddah. He lived with Tahir and his family, and even though he sensed that Tahir was using him, he was afraid to leave and return to his village, lest he be kidnapped and sold into slavery. One day, he met a young man about his age who recognized him and told him that he was the child whose hand got cut while Yahya tried to free him from his chain. The young man, Hamid, told Yahya that he was a slave of one of Jeddah's wealthy merchants. The two became friends, and one day, Hamid told Yahya the story of how he and his younger brother, Ghalib, were seduced by a man who offered them candy and sweets when they were playing in the fields outside their village, led to a deserted place, chained and kidnapped. They were kept in some isolated shack until two other kidnapped children from a neighboring village joined them. And then all of them were chained together and dragged behind the slave trader's horse from southern Saudi Arabia to the Hijaz, where all three were sold to local merchants. Hamid concluded his story by saying to Yahya that he should thank Allah for sending him a good man like Tahir to protect him from the dangers of the road and humiliating slavery. At this point, the readers already understand that the unintended irony in Hamid's words, which serves to highlight Yahya's situation as a de facto slave in the service of Tahir. Towards the end of the novel, Hamid appears again and tells Yahya about the Saudi regime's decision to abolish slavery in the country, and that his master had already signed his manumission or emancipation forms. Yahya is very happy for his friend, but Hamid is mainly concerned because throughout his life he has been accustomed to taking orders and obeying, but now suddenly he has a choice and free will, which he does not know what to do with. In addition, he has no job, no other skills but serving, and no place to go. In the end, Hamid, the slave, got emancipated and went back to his village to face an unknown future. Yahya freed himself from being a slave of Tahir and his family, but his future was no less obscure. He decided to move to another city, to Riyadh, which would probably eat him too. So, to conclude, Mudun Ta'kulu Le'ushb was the first Saudi novel to address the subject of slavery in the country seriously. It is also the only Saudi novel that tackles the unspoken phenomenon of what I call homegrown slavery. Later Saudi novels would talk about black slavery and its legacies of racial discrimination and oppression. But Mudun paved the way for the discussion about such matters as the seduction and kidnapping of children, the torments these children went through during the journey from the remote rural areas to the cities where they were sold into slavery, their life of servitude and slavery, and finally their emancipation that left the ex-slaves in a problematic position. However, as groundbreaking as this novel is in terms of dealing with the issue of slavery in Saudi Arabia, this subject does not occupy a central place in this novel, but serves to augment the main theme of the novel, which is the tangled rural-urban relations that started to be a burning socio-economic and socio-cultural issue in the period covered by this novel. Yahya's slavery story also serves as an allegory for the exploitation of the village by the city and of the naive villagers by the cynical city dwellers, as part of the never-ending cycle of exploitation one generation after another. While slavery was officially abolished in Saudi Arabia, the exploitation of the village by the city continued, and some would say still continues. As Abdul Khal wrote, "The time of slavery will never end. It is a Mercury-like time, constantly changing clothes and shapes. Thank you.